In the spring of 1993, President Bill Clinton set out to test a core assumption of post-Cold War U.S. foreign policy, that economic access could be translated into political leverage over China. Having pledged during his campaign to condition trade on human rights, Clinton issued an executive order tying the annual renewal of China's most favored nation, MFN status, to meaningful progress on a series of human rights criteria. The response was swift and hostile. American corporations warned that the policy would damage U.S. commercial interests, while Beijing threatened retaliation across diplomatic and economic fronts if its MFN status were revoked. Over the following year, China largely dismissed Washington's demands and made no serious effort to improve its human rights record. When the deadline arrived in 1994, Clinton renewed MFN unconditionally, later admitting that the approach had exhausted its utility. That episode set a lasting precedent. U.S. policymakers concluded that direct confrontation with China carried costs they were unwilling to bear. Engagement, rather than pressure, became the organizing principle of China policy. Washington sought to shape Beijing's behavior by integrating it into the global economy, most notably by backing China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001 and granting permanent normal trade relations the following year. Even as China's economic and geopolitical weight expanded, this engagement framework proved remarkably resilient. Successive administrations emphasized dialogue, cooperation, and crisis management, often elevating stability with Beijing as an objective in its own right. Yet stability has remained perpetually out of reach. Much like the MFN episode, China has repeatedly turned American overtures to its own advantage, alternating between soothing rhetoric and overt threats in order to push responsibility for managing the relationship onto Washington. Meanwhile, it has steadily accumulated coercive power while working to displace the United States at the top of the global order. Xi Jinping has been unambiguous about this ambition. At the Chinese Communist Party's 20th Congress in October 2022, he declared that China intends to become the world's leading power in overall national strength and international influence by mid-century. The October 2025 summit between President Donald Trump and Xi Jinping in Busan, South Korea, illustrates how enduring and misleading the engagement instinct remains. In the weeks before the meeting, Trump signaled a hard line, threatening sweeping controls on software exports to China. But the administration ultimately backed down after Beijing imposed restrictions on rare earth exports. The summit produced little more than a fragile ceasefire, a one-year pause on new trade penalties in exchange for non-binding Chinese promises to cooperate on fentanyl enforcement and modestly resume U.S. agricultural purchases. Chinese state media, by contrast, celebrated the outcome as proof that Beijing held Washington's industrial lifelines hostage. With a visit to Beijing scheduled for April 2026, the Trump administration has little time to recalibrate. Without a sober assessment of the Chinese Communist Party's strategic objectives, the United States risks repeating a familiar pattern, entering negotiations from a position of vulnerability, and mistaking tactical concessions for progress. To avoid that fate, Washington must more aggressively deploy the tools already at its disposal to reinforce U.S. economic and technological advantages. That means accelerating efforts to shift global trade away from China, tightening export controls on advanced semiconductors in coordination with allies, closing enforcement loopholes, and, most urgently, reducing dependence on Chinese-controlled supply chains for critical minerals. The pursuit of stability for its own sake with a regime committed to global primacy has proven not only futile, but dangerous. Blink 1st April 2025 marked a turning point. The Trump administration launched its Liberation Day tariffs, imposing duties on nearly all U.S. trading partners. China responded in kind, setting off an escalating trade confrontation that culminated in U.S. tariffs of 145% on Chinese imports, effectively an embargo. For the first time, however, Beijing deployed its industrial dominance directly, cutting off exports of rare earths. The move threatened to paralyze key American industries, from automotive manufacturing to defense production. China controls roughly 85% of global rare earth mining and an estimated 95% of processing and refining capacity, giving it unparalleled leverage. The impact was immediate. U.S. manufacturers warned of mounting delays and looming shutdowns. Within weeks, Washington blinked. A 90-day truce announced in May reduced tariffs on Chinese goods to 30%, while Beijing pledged, at least nominally, to restore access to rare earths. In reality, China maintained control through a restrictive export licensing system, approving shipments slowly and selectively. More concessions followed. In July, the administration reversed earlier export controls on NVIDIA's H20 chips. In August, it postponed the scheduled reimposition of higher tariffs for another 90 days, citing constructive talks, effectively granting Beijing time to entrench its leverage. Any pretense of firmness briefly wavered in September, when the Commerce Department tightened export control rules to prevent Chinese firms from accessing U.S. technology through subsidiaries and intermediaries. Beijing denounced the move as a grave threat to global supply chains and retaliated in October by expanding its rare earth export controls even further, raising the specter of widespread industrial disruption. By the time Trump and Xi met in Busan, Washington was negotiating under duress. Unsurprisingly, the resulting agreement favored Beijing. The United States immediately rolled back fentanyl-related tariffs and suspended new trade restrictions for a year. In return, it received Chinese assurances, largely unenforceable, that rare earth controls would be lifted and chip purchase bans eased. In practice, China tightened licensing requirements, extracted sensitive supply chain data from foreign firms, and continued restricting access to U.S. chips. Limited purchases of American soybeans served as symbolic gestures, calibrated to placate Trump while China advanced its long-term objectives. The main battlefield diplomatic theater should not distract from Beijing's strategic trajectory. The CCP's forthcoming 5-year plan, slated for adoption in March, makes clear that China intends to double down on state-led industrial policy, export-driven growth, and technological self-sufficiency. Advanced manufacturing is explicitly framed as the central arena of global competition. Influential Chinese scholars have echoed this view, urging resistance to Western values and prioritization of scalable industrial capacity as the decisive factor in international power. The 15th Five-Year Plan, 2026-30, formalizes Xi's long-standing effort to subordinate economic policy to national security. Provisions for a foreign-related national security mechanism and an overseas security guarantee system underscore Beijing's determination to insulate itself from external pressure while expanding its ability to coerce others. Most strikingly, the accompanying communiqué instructs the military to prepare for war, a stark departure from earlier plans focused primarily on development. The result is what analysts have described as a permanent siege mentality. China's economy and society are now structured for sustained confrontation with the United States. Despite acknowledging structural weaknesses, the plan offers little evidence of genuine reform. Instead of shifting toward consumption, Beijing continues to pour resources into state-directed manufacturing and exports. China's trade surplus reached a record $1.2 trillion last year, and the CCP appears intent on exporting domestic stagnation abroad. Already responsible for roughly one-third of global manufacturing output, China aims to expand that share further, using artificial intelligence as a force multiplier. AI occupies a central place in Beijing's strategy. The plan emphasizes AI-driven industrial transformation as a means of shaping a favorable external environment and tightening control over critical supply chains. For the United States and its allies, this underscores the need not only to reduce dependence on China, but also to prevent Beijing from converting AI advances into overwhelming industrial and military advantages. Start of something new. Effectively countering China requires a fundamental reordering of the global trade system. For decades, U.S. policy rested on the belief that integration would lead to liberalization. That wager failed, yet Washington continued to treat Asia as a unified production platform where efficiency trumped strategic risk. When the United States began adjusting course during Trump's first term, companies shifted production to Southeast Asia and Mexico. But China adapted quickly, rebuilding supply chains across the global south and exploiting transshipment routes to preserve U.S. market access. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer has argued that the post-war trade architecture no longer fits today's realities. The current moment, the so-called Trump round, represents a deliberate break from prioritizing efficiency over security. New trade and economic security agreements with countries such as Cambodia and Malaysia, with more pending, go far beyond tariffs. They include cooperation on export controls, investment screening, critical minerals, and enforcement against diversion, implicitly addressing vulnerabilities exposed after earlier China tariffs. Greer's strategy also emphasizes strengthening North America as a competitive manufacturing bloc. Rather than using the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement as leverage for brinkmanship, Washington should treat it as the foundation of a shared industrial strategy. Integrated supply chains in autos, aerospace, semiconductors, and medical devices offer a platform for coordinated rules of origin, aligned incentives, and collective barriers against Chinese dumping. This approach is already bearing fruit. Mexico has surpassed China as the United States' largest goods trading partner, and Washington has expanded trade frameworks across Latin America. U.S. tariffs have sharply reduced dependence on China. Chinese imports now account for a smaller share of U.S. trade than before China joined the WTO. But that progress depends on maintaining a meaningful tariff gap. Trump's recent concessions narrowed that gap, weakening incentives to diversify. While Greer retains authority to restore higher tariffs, political concerns about upsetting the truce with Xi may constrain action. Short-term compromises, however, only defer the reckoning between engagement and decoupling. The chip gap. Trade realignment improves resilience, but enduring advantage lies in exploiting technological asymmetries, especially in advanced computing. AI will reshape economic and military power for decades, and U.S. dominance in chip design, fabrication, and cloud infrastructure remains its most potent source of leverage. Against that backdrop, the December 2025 decision to license exports of NVIDIA's H200 chips to China was a profound mistake. Framed as a commercial win, it directly contradicted U.S. national security strategy, which explicitly calls for denying adversaries access to advanced computing. Supplying cutting-edge AI chips to China accelerates Beijing's ambitions and risks ensuring that the AI revolution bears a Chinese imprint. Compute power is China's primary constraint. U.S. chips are currently several times more powerful than China's best domestic alternatives, with the gap projected to widen dramatically by 2027. Production capacity disparities are even greater. Chinese leaders know this. Xi has openly acknowledged the shortfall, and Chinese AI executives have conceded that U.S. advantages may exceed theirs by orders of magnitude. The notion that China can be kept dependent on U.S. technology through continued sales ignores the CCP's consistent playbook: import, replace, displace, dominate. Beijing has already funneled roughly $150 billion into its semiconductor sector and is preparing tens of billions more. Exporting advanced chips undermines the very leverage that constrains China's ambitions, enabling faster progress in military modernization, AI development, and self-sufficiency. Looser controls also threaten U.S. leadership in cloud computing, where American firms vastly outinvest their Chinese rivals. Chips shipped to China are chips unavailable for domestic infrastructure. Worse, embedding Chinese technology in global data centers introduces serious security risks, from data exfiltration to sabotage. Washington already has the authority to block risky connected technologies and should use it. Operation Mineral Security. Even the strongest trade and technology controls will fail if the United States remains dependent on China for the raw materials that underpin modern industry. Rare earths are the most acute vulnerability. Without them, the United States cannot build advanced weapons, power AI infrastructure, or manufacture essential electronics. Recent steps, cooperation with Australia and Japan, executive orders to accelerate domestic mining and processing, have laid groundwork, but they must now be scaled dramatically. China's dominance rests on three choke points: access to heavy rare earths, near total control over processing, and leadership in magnet production. Beijing spent decades entrenching these advantages and has already demonstrated its willingness to weaponize them. Addressing this challenge requires an approach akin to Operation Warp Speed. An Operation Mineral Security should mobilize public and private capital to rapidly build mining, refining, separation, and magnet capacity outside China. Long-term offtake agreements, public financing, strategic stockpiles, and targeted subsidies can counter Chinese price manipulation and retaliation. Markets alone will not solve this problem, but coordinated state action can. The lesson Washington should have learned in 1994 remains unchanged. Tactical concessions do not produce lasting cooperation. They invite exploitation. Stability with a communist regime determined to dominate is an illusion. Breaking the cycle demands building leverage and resilience that Beijing cannot shut off at will.